Okay, students, today we're going to talk about the original anatomy of the head, in which our topic is the meninges. The brain, as well as the spinal cord, is surrounded by the three layers of membranes, what we call the meninges, a tough outer layer, what we call that dura mater, a delicate middle layer, we call that arachnoid mater, and a thin layer firmly attached to the surface of the brain, we call that pia mater. Cranial meninges are continuous with and similar to the spinal meninges to the foramen magnum, with one important distinction that after a moment I will talk about, that what is the difference between the cranial and the spinal dura mater. Let's carry on to the cranial dura mater. Cranial dura mater is a thick, tough outer covering of the brain. It consists of an outer periosteal layer, which one is very closely with the bone, and the inner meningeal layer. The outer periosteal layer is firmly attached to the skull, is actually the periosteum of the cranial cavity, and contain the meningeal arteries, as we can see here, meningeal arteries. And is continuous with the periosteum on the outer surface of the skull at the foramen magnum and at other intracranial foraminium. The inner layer, the meningeal layer. Meningeal layer is in close contact with the arachnoid mater, as we can see here, and is continuous with the spinal dura mater through the foramen magnum. The cranial dura mater forming the two unique type of structures. What are those two unique types? One is the dural partition. As we can see here that it is making the partition, which projects inward and incompletely separate the parts of the brain. The second unique structure formed by the cranial dura mater, that is the intracranial venous structure, and that is here. Intracranial venous structure, we will call them sinuses. Later on we will also talk about in other topics. Now we are here for the comparison that what exactly the difference between the cranial meninges and the spinal meninges. No doubt they both are the three layers, dura mater, arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. But the difference is the dura mater. In the cranial cavity, the dura mater is a double layer, periosteal and meningeal. In the spinal, it is only the single layer, which is only the meningeal layer. So this is the difference between the cranial and the spinal meninges. Next, we are going to talk about furthermore about the dural partitions. Dural partition projects into the cranial cavity and partially subdivide the cranial cavity into the following. As we can see here, the falx cerebri. Here we got the tentorium cerebelli, a very small here in the occipital posteriorly downside, falx cerebelli, and here we got the diaphragma cellae. We will talk about each of these very detailedly today. Talk about the falx cerebri. First of all, is a crescent shape. It is a downward projection of meningeal dura mater from the dural lining, the calva or calvaria that passes between the two cerebral hemispheres. It is attaching anteriorly to the crista galli of the ethmoid bone and the frontal crust of the frontal bone, and following the skirts and posteriorly it is attached to and blend with the tentorium cerebelli. Now let's talk about the tentorium cerebelli. It is the horizontal projection of the meningeal dura mater that covers and separates the cerebellum. in the posterior cranial fossa from the part of the cerebral hemisphere. It is attached posteriorly to the occipital bone along the grooves for the transverse sinuses, both sides here. Laterally, it is attached to the superior border of the petrous part of the temporal bone, ending anteriorly at the anterior and the posterior clinoid processes, as we can see here. The anterior and the medial border of the tentorium cerebelli are free. Especially this part we can see here is making an oval opening in the midline. We call that tentorial notch, this one, through which the midbrain is passes. Now let's talk about the falx cerebelli. Is a small midline, as we can see here, a very small midline. I will try to point out here this portion, very small midline. So this place here, the falx cerebelli, is a small midline projection of meningeal dura mater in the posterior cranial fossa. It is attached posteriorly to the internal occipital crust. In the bone marking of the cranial cavity, we talk about the internal occipital crust. There it is attaching. And superiorly to the tentorium cerebelli. Its anterior edge is free and is between the two cerebellar hemispheres. Now we're going to talk about the last dural partition, that is a diaphragm macellae. The final or the last dural projection is a diaphragm macellae, as we can see here, very small here. A small horizontal shelf of the meningeal dura mater covers the hypophyseal fossa. Hypophyseal fossa we have talked about in the sphenoid bone. There is an opening in the center of the diaphragm macellae through which the passes the infundibulum, that is the stalk, that is attachment of the pituitary gland or hypophyseal gland with the brain. So that is passing through here from the diaphragm macellae. Now we will talk about here we got the original picture in which we can see here the falx cerebelli, tentorium cerebelli, falx cerebelli we can see here, and here we can see the notch, and this part here, diaphragm macellae. The artery supply. If you're talking about the artery supply to the dura mater, first of all, I want to say that they travel in the outer periosteal layer of the dura mater and consists of the three divisions as according to the cranial fossa: anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, and the posterior cranial fossa. So we got here the anterior meningeal arteries in the anterior cranial fossa. They are actually the branches from the ethmoidal arteries. We got here the middle cranial fossa. We got here the middle meningeal artery and its companion, we call that accessory meningeal artery in this part. In the posterior cranial fossa, we got the posterior meningeal arteries. So let's talk about here each of them. Anterior one we got here as the branches from the ethmoidal. So middle meningeal artery is actually the branch from the maxillary artery, and here we can see its anterior division and the posterior division. So anterior division is passing through the pterion, which one is the clinical point. As the injury happened here, then the extradural hematoma could happen. So we got here as the middle meningeal artery is the branch from the maxillary artery. It entered the middle cranial fossa through the foramen spinosum and divides into the anterior and the posterior branches. We can see here very clearly. We got here the anterior branch passes in a most vertical direction to reach to the vertex of the skull. and it also crossing the pterion. The posterior branch here, we can see in the posterior superior direction supplying this region and the middle cranial fossa. We go to the accessory meningeal artery, which one in this diagram we can see is usually a small branch of the maxillary artery that enters the middle cranial fossa through the foramen oval and supply the area medial to this foramen. We can see the posteriorly here. We go to the posterior meningeal arteries. So posterior meningeal arteries, in which we got here, first of all we can see here actually this is the external carotid artery. From the external carotid artery we got here posteriorly this part. This is the occipital artery, so branches from the occipital artery. And next we got here ascending pharyngeal artery here, this one. So branches from the ascending pharyngeal artery also contributing in it. So occipital and ascending pharyngeal also contributing to give the posterior cranial fossa. And also we got here some branches from the vertebral arteries. Those are also, for example here, this branch is from the vertebral artery, and this one here is also from the vertebral artery. So these branches are coming from the vertebral arteries to give the supply to the posterior cranial fossa. Now we will talk about the innervation. So innervation of the dura mater is by the small meningeal branches of all three divisions of the trigeminal nerve, but mainly, as we can see, the light green color here is most of the part we can say that is from the ophthalmic branch of the trigeminal nerve, and rest of that we can see here the medial and the lateral part of the middle cranial fossa. We are having here the maxillary and the mandibular branch from the trigeminal nerve is giving the supply here. So dominant part of the partition is by the trigeminal nerve branches, and we got here also the supply from the vagus nerve, which is number 10 cranial nerve, and also from the first, second and the third cervical nerves. According to some writers, may also the branches from the glossopharyngeal and the hypoglossal nerve in the posterior cranial fossa may give the supply to the meninges. Now we're going to talk about the arachnoid matter. So arachnoid matter is a thin avascular membrane that lines but is not adherent to the inner surface of the dura mater. This processes we got here the thin processes from here, as we can see, or trabeculi we can see. Those are returning the cerebrospinal fluid back into the venous blood. Unlike the PA, the arachnoid does not enter the grooves or the fissures of the brain except for the longitudinal, as we can see here in the longitudinal it is going longitudinal fissure between the two cerebral hemispheres. We got the pia mater, the third layer. So the pia mater is a thin, a delicate membrane. Red color membrane, as we can see here, is marked as red. So a thin delicate membrane that closely invests the surface of the brain. It follows the contours of the brain, enter the grooves and the fissures on the surface, and it closely applied to the roots of the cranial nerves at their origin too. Now we'll talk about the arrangements of meninges. We have already done with the 3 layers of meninges. Now we are talking about the arrangement and the spaces. So we go to the 2 kind of spaces here, that the real and the potential spaces. So a potential space is related to the dura mater, while a real space exists between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, which is already present, and the cerebrospinal fluid is passing through there or moving through there. So bleeding into the extradural space due to the rupture of the meningeal artery or a torn in the dural venous sinus result in an extradural hematoma. Again, please, the bleeding into the extradural space due to rupture of the meningeal artery or a torn of dural venous sinus result in an extradural hematoma. I will show you the two radiograph for the CT scan that to compare the extradural and the subdural hematoma after a moment. So bleeding due to the tearing of a vein as it enters the dural venous sinus can result in the subdural hematoma. So make sure extradural and subdural hematoma. So let's see there we got here the axial CT scan of the brain, in which we can see here the extradural hematoma. So extradural hematoma on the CT scan, we can see the marking that how it should show. It should show the lens shape. What kind of lens? Biconvex. One convexity is coming from the skull here, and another convexity because the dural layer is detaching from the, due to the pressure, it is detaching from the skull. So that's how it is accumulating the blood here. That's it's forming the extradural hematoma. This radiograph, in which we can see the axial CT scan of the brain, and we can see here the subdural hematoma. So subdural hematoma, we can see that it is showing the crescent shape. So very easy to identify the biconvex and the crescent shape. So biconvex lens shape, that is the extradural, and crescent shape is the subdural. Easy to identify in the radiograph. Subarachnoid space. Deep thoraconoid matter is the only normally occurring fluid-filled space associated with the meninges. In certain location, it enlarges into the expanded areas, what we call the subarachnoid cisterns. It contains the cerebrospinal fluid. We call that CSF, and blood vessels. We can see here. Okay, now we can see here the subarachnoid hemorrhage in this CT scan. So subarachnoid hemorrhage may occur in the patient who have undergone significant cerebral trauma, but typically it results from the rupture intercerebral aneurysm arising from the vessels supplying and around the atrial sulcus, what we call that circle of Willis. Talking about the cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid is produced by the choroid plexus, mainly in the ventricles of the brain. It is a clear, colorless, cell-free fluid that circulates through the subarachnoid space, surrounds the brain and spinal cord. The cerebrospinal fluid returns to the venous system through the arachnoid villi, as we can see here. This projects as clumps arachnoid granulation into the superior sagittal sinus, which is a dural venous sinus, and its lateral extension, what we call that lateral lacunae. We can't see the lateral lacunae in this picture, so we can see here the lateral lacunae. Okay, thank you.